The sun was setting over Maple Heights, one of those neighborhoods where every house looked like it belonged in a magazine. Perfect lawns, expensive cars in driveways, and streets so clean you could eat off them. It was the kind of place where people paid good money to feel safe and separate from the rest of the world. Officer David Chen had been patrolling these streets for 3 years now. At 28, he thought he knew everything about keeping the peace. He drove slowly through the quiet streets in his patrol car, eyes always scanning for anything that seemed out of place. That was his job, or at least that's how he saw it. As he turned onto Elm Street, something caught his attention. An old black man was walking slowly down the sidewalk, moving with the careful steps of someone whose joints had seen better days. The man looked to be in his 70s, wearing a simple brown jacket that had clearly been through many seasons. His pants were clean but faded, and his shoes were old but polished. In his weathered hands, he carried a small bunch of white flowers. David felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't right. People like that didn't belong in neighborhoods like this. Not at this time of day. Not walking around like he owned the place. David had seen enough crime shows and read enough reports to know that burglars often dressed down to avoid suspicion. They'd case houses during the day, pretending to be maintenance workers or visitors, then come back later when it was dark. The old man moved slowly, occasionally glancing at house numbers. To David, this looked like someone checking out potential targets. The flowers were probably just a prop, something to make him look innocent. It was a clever trick, but David wasn't falling for it. He pulled his patrol car to the curb about 20 feet ahead of the man and got out. The sound of the car door slamming echoed in the quiet evening air. David straightened his uniform and adjusted his belt, making sure his badge was clearly visible. He wanted to look official, authoritative. "Excuse me, sir," David called out, his voice carrying that tone cops use when they want to sound polite but firm. "I need to have a word with you." The old man stopped walking and turned toward David. His face was kind, with deep lines that spoke of many years and many smiles. When he looked at David, there was no fear in his eyes, just a quiet patience that seemed to come from a lifetime of dealing with difficult situations. "Good evening." "Officer," the man said, his voice soft but clear. "How can I help you?" David walked closer, studying the man's face for signs of guilt or nervousness. Instead, he found only calm respect. This threw him off for a moment, but he pushed forward with his questioning. "I'm going to need to ask what you're doing in this neighborhood," David said, crossing his arms. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area." This wasn't entirely true. There had been one break-in 3 weeks ago, but that was hardly a crime wave. Still, David felt justified in his approach. Better safe than sorry, especially in a neighborhood where people expected protection. The old man nodded slowly, as if he understood the question perfectly. "I'm visiting someone, officer. Just bringing these flowers to pay my respects." "Pay your respects?" David repeated, his suspicion growing. "Who exactly are you visiting at this time of day? Most people don't make social calls this late." It was only 7:30 in the evening, hardly late by most standards, but David wanted to keep the pressure on. In his experience, guilty people cracked under pressure, and innocent people could prove their innocence quickly enough. "I visit every week," the old man explained patiently. "Been doing it for years now. The family knows I come around this time." David looked around the expensive neighborhood. These weren't the kind of people who would be friends with someone who looked like this old man. The story didn't add up. Rich people had rich friends. That was just how the world worked. "I'm going to need to see some identification," David said, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. "And I'll need the address of where you're supposedly going." The word supposedly hung in the air like an accusation. The old man heard it clearly, and for just a moment something flickered in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but perhaps sadness at being doubted by someone young enough to be his grandson. "Of course, officer," the man said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. His movements were deliberate and careful, the actions of someone who understood that sudden moves around police officers could be dangerous. David tensed, his hand moving closer to his weapon. You never knew what people might pull out of their pockets. He'd been trained to expect the worst and hope for the best. The old man produced a worn leather wallet and opened it with hands that shook slightly. Age or nerves, David couldn't tell which. From the wallet, he pulled out an old driver's license and handed it to David. Harold, Washington, David read aloud, studying the license. The address was from across town, in one of the older neighborhoods where houses were smaller and property values were lower. This confirmed David's suspicions even more. "You're a long way from home, Mr. Washington," David said, handing the license back. "What's the address you're visiting here?" Harold put his license away carefully and looked up at David. "It's 847 Elm Street. The Mitchell family. I've been visiting them for more than 20 years now." David knew that address. It was one of the biggest houses on the street, worth probably close to $2 million. The idea that this old man in his worn clothes had been visiting there for 20 years seemed impossible. Rich people didn't maintain friendships across class lines for that long. "It just didn't happen. 20 years?" David said, his voice full of doubt. "And what's the nature of this relationship?" Harold was quiet for a moment, looking down at the flowers in his hands. They were simple white carnations, the kind you might find at any grocery store. Not expensive, but chosen with care. "It's personal, officer," Harold said finally. "A matter of respect and remembrance." This vague answer only made David more suspicious. Guilty people always gave vague answers when pressed for details. They tried to sound mysterious instead of just telling the truth. "I'm afraid I'm going to need more than that," David said, stepping closer. "We take security seriously in this neighborhood. People here pay good money to feel safe, and part of my job is making sure that people who don't belong here aren't causing problems." The words came out harsher than David had intended, but he didn't take them back. Sometimes you had to be direct with people. Sometimes that was the only way to get the truth. Harold looked up at David with those patient eyes again. There was something in his expression that David couldn't quite read. Not anger, not fear, but something deeper, something that made David feel uncomfortable without understanding why. "I understand you're doing your job, officer," Harold said quietly. "I respect that. But I'm not causing any problems. I'm just an old man bringing flowers to honor someone who meant a great deal to me." David felt his radio crackle with another call somewhere across town, but he ignored it. This situation wasn't resolved yet, and he wasn't about to let someone suspicious walk away just because they seemed polite. David wasn't satisfied with Harold's answers. Something about this whole situation felt wrong to him, and his training had taught him to trust his instincts. In his 3 years on the force, he'd learned that people who seemed too calm, too polite, were often hiding something. Innocent people got nervous when questioned by police. They stuttered. They fumbled for words. They showed signs of stress. Harold's calm demeanor only made David more suspicious. "I'm going to need you to empty your pockets," David said, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "Standard procedure when we're investigating suspicious activity." Harold looked at David for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. The patience was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Disappointment, maybe, or resignation. It was the look of someone who had been through this before, who knew how these situations usually went. "Is that really necessary, officer?" Harold asked quietly. "I've shown you my identification. I've told you where I'm going. I'm not sure what more I can do to prove I'm not a threat." "Sir, I'm going to need you to cooperate with my investigation," David replied, his hand resting on his radio. "The sooner you follow my instructions, the sooner we can resolve this situation." Harold sighed deeply and began reaching into his pockets. From his right pocket, he pulled out a small handful of change, maybe $2 in quarters and dimes. From his left pocket came an old cell phone, the kind with physical buttons that had been popular 10 years ago. His wallet he had already shown. From his jacket pocket, he produced a small folded piece of paper. David examined each item carefully. The paper turned out to be a grocery store receipt from earlier that day. Harold had bought the flowers, some bread, and a carton of milk. Nothing suspicious there, but David wasn't ready to let his guard down. "What's in the bag?" David asked, pointing to a small paper bag Harold had been carrying along with the flowers. "Just some cookies," Harold said, opening the bag to show David. Inside were homemade chocolate chip cookies wrapped in plastic wrap. "I baked them this morning." This detail struck David as odd. Why would someone planning to rob houses spend time baking cookies? But instead of reconsidering his suspicions, David found a new angle to pursue. "Who exactly are you bringing cookies and flowers to?" David asked. "I find it hard to believe that someone from your neighborhood would be close friends with people who live in houses like these." The words hung in the air, and David immediately realized how they sounded. He hadn't meant to be quite so direct about the class differences, but now that it was out there, he decided to push forward. Sometimes the truth was uncomfortable. Harold's expression didn't change, but his grip on the flowers tightened slightly. "I've known the Mitchell family for a very long time, officer. Mr. Mitchell served with me in Korea." "Korea?" David repeated, his skepticism clear in his voice. "That was over 70 years ago. You're telling me you've maintained a friendship for 7 decades? Some friendships run deeper than others," Harold said simply. David was about to respond when he noticed that they were no longer alone. A woman walking her dog had stopped on the sidewalk about 50 feet away, clearly watching the interaction. Across the street, a man getting his mail from his mailbox had paused to observe what was happening. David felt a flash of irritation. These wealthy residents always acted like they had the right to scrutinize police work. "Ma'am, please move along," David called to the woman with the dog. "This is police business." The woman didn't move. Instead, she pulled out her phone and held it up. David realized with growing annoyance that she was recording the interaction. Great. This was exactly what he didn't need. Every police interaction these days seemed to end up on social media, with people who didn't understand law enforcement making judgments about situations they knew nothing about. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over to my patrol car," David said to Harold, his voice getting firmer. "I want to verify your story before I let you proceed." Harold glanced at the woman recording and then back at David. "Officer, I really do need to get going. The family is expecting me and I don't want them to worry." "The family can wait," David snapped, his patience finally wearing thin. "Right now you need to focus on cooperating with my investigation." More people were starting to notice the commotion. A couple had come out onto their front porch and were watching from across the street. Someone else was looking out their window. David felt the weight of their attention and knew he needed to establish control of the situation quickly. "Place your hands on the hood of my car," David instructed, pointing to his patrol vehicle. Harold hesitated. "Officer, I don't think this is necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." "Sir, I'm not going to ask again," David said, his hand moving to his belt. "Place your hands on the car now." The watching neighbors were getting closer now, drawn by the escalating tension. David could hear whispered conversations, people asking each other what was happening. Some were pulling out their phones to record. The situation was spiraling beyond what David had intended, but he felt like he couldn't back down now. If he let Harold go without a thorough investigation, and something did happen in the neighborhood later, he'd be held responsible. Harold slowly walked to the patrol car and placed his weathered hands on the hood. David began a pat-down search, checking for weapons or contraband. Harold stood perfectly still during the search, his dignity intact despite the humiliating circumstances. "What's your relationship with the Mitchell family again?" David asked as he searched. "I told you we served together in Korea," Harold replied quietly. "And they just let you come around whenever you want? Just show up at their house unannounced?" "It's not unannounced," Harold said. "I come every Tuesday at 7:30. I've been doing it for over 20 years. David finished his search, finding nothing suspicious. No weapons, no tools that could be used for breaking and entering. Nothing that supported his theory that Harold was planning a crime. But instead of accepting that he might have been wrong, David felt more frustrated. Sometimes criminals were just very good at hiding their intentions. "I'm going to call the Mitchell family to verify your story," David announced, pulling out his phone. "They're not expecting a call," Harold said, his voice still patient but with an edge of weariness. "They're expecting me to arrive at their door just like I have every Tuesday for the past 23 years. David looked up the Mitchell family's phone number online. It took him a few minutes of searching, during which Harold remained standing by the patrol car, hands still on the hood. The growing crowd of neighbors continued to watch and record, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of background noise. Finally, David found a number and dialed. The phone rang several times before someone answered. "Hello, this is Officer Chen with the Maple Heights Police Department," David said when someone picked up. "I have an elderly black male here who claims to be visiting your family. Can you verify if you're expecting anyone this evening?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a woman's voice, sharp with concern. "What do you mean you have someone? What's going on?" "Ma'am, I'm conducting a routine investigation of suspicious activity in your neighborhood. This individual claims to visit your family regularly, but I need to verify his story." "Describe him," the woman said, her voice tight with what sounded like anger. David looked at Harold, still standing by the car with his flowers and cookies. Elderly black male, 70s, carrying flowers. Says his name is Harold Washington. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that David thought the call might have dropped. When the woman finally spoke again, her voice was cold with fury. "Officer, you need to let Mr. Washington go immediately, and then you need to explain to me why you're harassing a decorated war veteran who has been a friend of our family for over 2 decades. David felt his stomach drop. This wasn't the response he had expected. He had been sure that the family would have no idea who Harold was, that they would confirm his suspicions about Harold being up to no good. "Ma'am, I was just verifying his identity as part of standard security procedures," David said, trying to maintain his professional tone. "Standard security procedures?" The woman repeated, her voice rising. "Is it standard procedure to assume that an elderly man carrying flowers is a criminal? Is it standard procedure to humiliate someone based on their appearance?" David could feel the situation slipping away from him. The neighbors were closer now, and he could hear fragments of their conversations. They were talking about racial profiling, about police overreach, about how this kind of thing happened too often. Their voices were getting louder, more critical. "I'm coming outside right now," the woman on the phone said, "and you better have a very good explanation for why you've detained our friend." The line went dead, leaving David standing there with his phone in his hand and a sinking feeling in his chest. Around him, the crowd of neighbors continued to grow, their expressions ranging from concern to angry. Harold remained by the patrol car, waiting patiently for David to tell him what to do next. David realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether this situation ended quietly or became something much bigger. The phones recording everything guaranteed that his actions would be scrutinized, analyzed, and probably shared widely on social media. He looked at Harold, still standing with his hands on the car, and for the first time began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. David didn't have to wait long. Less than 2 minutes after the phone call ended, the front door of 847 Elm Street burst open. A woman in her 50s rushed out, her face flushed with anger and concern. She was clearly someone used to being taken seriously, well-dressed, confident in her movements with the kind of presence that commanded attention. Behind her, moving more slowly but with equal determination, came an elderly white man using a walking cane. Despite his age, there was something unmistakably authoritative about him. His silver hair was neatly combed, and even in casual clothes he carried himself with the dignity of someone who had spent decades in positions of responsibility. "Mr. Washington," the woman called out as she hurried down the sidewalk. "Are you all right?" Harold finally lifted his hands from the patrol car and turned toward the approaching voices. For the first time since this whole encounter began, David saw something change in Harold's expression. The patient resignation was replaced by genuine warmth and relief. "I'm fine, Patricia," Harold called back. "Just a misunderstanding, Patricia." David felt his heart sink even further as he realized this was likely the homeowner he had just spoken with on the phone. The woman who had sounded so angry, so protective of Harold. As she got closer, David could see that her anger hadn't diminished. If anything, seeing Harold standing by the police car seemed to have made her even more furious. "Officer Chen, I presume," Patricia said as she reached them, her voice dripping with controlled rage. "Would you mind explaining to me why Mr. Washington has been detained like a common criminal?" The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, and David was acutely aware that every word of this conversation was being recorded by multiple phones. He tried to summon his professional training, to find a way to explain his actions that would sound reasonable and justified. "Ma'am, I was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood," David began, falling back on the standard language he'd been taught to use. "When I observed an individual who appeared to be casing houses, I felt it was necessary to investigate." "Casing houses?" Patricia repeated, her voice getting louder. "Mr. Washington has been visiting our family every Tuesday evening for 23 years. Every single Tuesday, Officer Chen, rain or shine, summer or winter. He brings flowers to our memorial garden and spends time with my father. How exactly does that constitute suspicious activity?" David glanced around at the watching neighbors. Their expressions ranged from curious to openly hostile. He could hear murmured comments about racial profiling, about police harassment, about how this was exactly the kind of thing that was wrong with law enforcement today. The elderly man with the cane had reached them now, breathing slightly hard from the walk but with fire in his eyes that belied his age. When he looked at Harold, his expression softened completely. "Hello, old friend," he said, reaching out to clasp Harold's hand. "I'm sorry about this." "Don't worry about it, Robert," Harold replied, and David could hear the genuine affection in his voice. "These things happen. Robert Mitchell." David remembered the name from the phone call, and pieces began clicking into place. This was clearly the head of the household, the person Harold claimed to have served with in Korea. But looking at the two men together, David found their friendship hard to believe. They came from completely different worlds, Harold with his worn clothes and modest demeanor, Robert with his obvious wealth and education. "Officer," Robert said, turning his attention to David, "I'm Robert Mitchell. This is my daughter Patricia, and this," he gestured toward Harold, "is one of the finest men I've ever had the privilege to know. Now, would you care to explain why you've been treating him like a criminal?" David felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "Sir, I was following standard procedure for investigating suspicious persons in the neighborhood. I had no way of knowing about your relationship with Mr. Washington." "Suspicious persons?" Robert's voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that made David nervous. "What exactly made Mr. Washington suspicious? The fact that he was walking while black? The fact that he doesn't drive a luxury car? Help me understand your reasoning here." The questions hit David like physical blows. He wanted to explain about his training, about crime statistics, about the need to be proactive in preventing break-ins. But with Harold standing right there, dignified despite everything that had happened, those explanations sounded hollow even in his own mind. "Dad," Patricia said, placing a hand on her father's arm, "let's focus on making sure Mr. Washington is okay." She turned to Harold with obvious concern. "Are you hurt? Did he put handcuffs on you? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine, dear," Harold assured her. The officer was just doing his job as he understood it. This generous response seemed to make Patricia even angrier. "No, he wasn't. Harassing innocent people isn't part of any police officer's job description." David wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had been trying to protect the neighborhood, that his intentions had been good even if his execution had been flawed. But every word that came to mind sounded like an excuse. "Perhaps," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to, "you could explain to me what specific behavior you observed that led you to conclude Mr. Washington was engaged in criminal activity." David looked around at the crowd that had gathered. There had to be at least 15 people watching now, all of them clearly sympathetic to Harold and critical of David's actions. Their phones were still recording, capturing every word for posterity and social media. He was walking slowly through the neighborhood, checking house numbers. David said, knowing how weak it sounded even as he said it, "In my experience, that's consistent with someone casing houses for potential burglary." "Checking house numbers," Robert repeated slowly. "You mean like someone might do if they were looking for a specific address? Like someone might do if they were trying to find the house they've been visiting for over 2 decades. David felt his face burn with embarrassment. When Robert put it that way, David's reasoning sounded absurd. But he pressed on, trying to salvage something from his position. "The flowers could have been a prop," David said. "Criminals sometimes use everyday items to appear innocent while they scout potential targets." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Even the neighbors had stopped their whispered conversations. Everyone was staring at David with expressions that ranged from disbelief to disgust. Patricia broke the silence with a laugh that had no humor in it. "A prop? You think Mr. Washington's weekly memorial flowers are a prop for some elaborate burglary scheme?" "Memorial flowers?" David asked, confused. Robert's expression softened as he looked at Harold. "Officer Chen, Mr. Washington brings those flowers every Tuesday to honor my son who died in Korea, serving alongside Mr. Washington in one of the most brutal battles of that war." David felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't just about a friendship between veterans. This was about shared trauma, shared loss, shared sacrifice. Harold wasn't just visiting old friends, he was honoring the dead. "Your son," David began, but trailed off, not sure what to say. "My son Tommy," Robert continued, his voice thick with emotion, 20 years old when he died. Mr. Washington was with him when it happened. He held my boy in his arms and promised he would take care of us, take care of Tommy's memory, and for 23 years, he has kept that promise." Harold looked down at the flowers in his hands. white carnations that suddenly seemed precious beyond measure. "Tommy saved my life twice in Korea," he said quietly. "The least I can do is make sure he's not forgotten." David stared at Harold, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since this encounter began. This wasn't a potential criminal. This was a man who had served his country with honor, who had lost friends in war, who had spent decades honoring a promise made to a dying soldier. This was a man whose character and service put David's own contributions to shame. David started, then stopped. What could he say? How could he apologize for assumptions that had been so fundamentally wrong, so hurtful, so revealing of his own prejudices? The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that something important was happening. The phones were still recording, but now they were capturing a different kind of moment. Not just police harassment, but the revelation of truth. The exposure of heroism where ignorance had seen only suspicion. Patricia looked at David with contempt that was palpable. "This man," she said, gesturing toward Harold, "has shown our family more loyalty and love than most people show their own relatives. He has never missed a Tuesday in 23 years unless he was in the hospital. He bakes cookies for my children, brings flowers for my brother's memory, and sits with my father sharing stories of their service together. And you treated him like a criminal." David wanted to disappear. He wanted to go back in time and handle this differently. He wanted to explain that he wasn't really a racist, that he had just been trying to do his job, that he would never intentionally hurt someone like Harold. But the explanation stuck in his throat because deep down he knew they weren't entirely true. Robert stepped closer to David, leaning heavily on his cane. Despite his age, there was something intimidating about his presence. "Officer Chen, I'm going to give you some advice. In my 40 years as a judge, I learned that the measure of a person isn't in their authority or their uniform or their assumptions about others. It's in their character, their service, and their respect for human dignity. Mr. Washington has more of all three than you've shown tonight." A judge. Robert Mitchell had been a judge for 40 years. David felt his career flashing before his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. This wasn't just about embarrassing himself in front of some wealthy residents. This was about harassing the friend of one of the most respected judges in the state, a man who likely had connections throughout the legal and political establishment. Harold placed a gentle hand on Robert's arm. "It's all right, Robert. The officer was trying to keep your neighborhood safe. I understand his concern." This grace, this forgiveness in the face of humiliation somehow made David feel even worse. Harold was protecting him, showing him kindness he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. It was the behavior of someone whose character had been forged in circumstances David couldn't imagine, tested in ways David hoped never to experience. Robert looked at Harold with a mixture of affection and frustration. "Harold, you're too kind for your own good. This officer needs to understand exactly who he was treating like a criminal." Patricia pulled out her phone, not to record like the neighbors, but to search for something specific. "Officer Chen, since you seem to have such a problem believing that Mr. Washington belongs in this neighborhood, maybe you need to see exactly who he is." David watched nervously as Patricia scrolled through her phone. The crowd of neighbors pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Their phones continued recording, capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming a much bigger story than a simple police stop. "Here," Patricia said, turning her phone screen toward David. "This is Mr. Washington in 1952. David looked at the black and white photograph on the screen. It showed a young black soldier in military uniform, standing proud and serious beside an American flag. The face was unmistakably Harold's, though Deck 80 years younger. But what caught David's attention was something gleaming on the uniform, a medal that even David, with his limited military knowledge, recognized as significant. "Is that?" David began, but his voice trailed off. "The Medal of Honor," Robert said quietly, "the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government, presented to Mr. Washington for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidness at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." David stared at the photo, then at Harold, then back at the photo. The Medal of Honor. He had just detained, searched, and humiliated a Medal of Honor recipient. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Patricia wasn't finished. She scrolled to another photo, this one from a newspaper clipping. "Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, October 1951. Sergeant Harold Washington single-handedly held off an enemy assault for over 6 hours, allowing his wounded comrades to be evacuated. He was shot 3 times but refused medical attention until every other American soldier was safe. The neighbors had gone completely silent now. Even the sound of traffic from the main road seemed muted. Everyone was focused on the phone screen, on the revelation of Harold's extraordinary service and sacrifice. "Show him the citation," Robert said softly. Patricia scrolled again, finding the official Medal of Honor citation. She began reading aloud. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant Washington's extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty resulted in the saving of numerous lives and reflected the highest credit upon himself and the United States Army." David felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't just about mistaking an innocent man for a criminal. This was about humiliating a genuine American hero, a man who had literally risked his life to save others, a man whose courage and sacrifice had been officially recognized by his country. After the war, Robert continued, Harold could have parlayed his Medal of Honor into fame, fortune, speaking engagements, book deals. Instead, he came home and worked quietly as a maintenance supervisor at the local high school for 35 years. Never sought recognition, never traded on his war record, just served his community with the same dedication he showed in combat. Harold shifted uncomfortably, clearly not enjoying being the center of attention. "Robert, there's no need to go through all this." The officer understands now, but Robert wasn't ready to let it go. "No, Harold. He needs to understand completely. Officer Chen, do you know what Mr. Washington did after my son was killed in Korea?" David shook his head, afraid to speak. "He made a promise," Robert said, his voice heavy with emotion. "He promised Tommy as he lay dying that he would look after Tommy's family. And he has kept that promise for over 70 years. He attended my wedding, held my daughters when they were babies, walked Patricia down the aisle when I was too sick to do it myself. He's been like a second father to my children and a brother to me." Patricia wiped tears from her eyes as she added, "When my mother was dying of cancer, Mr. Washington sat by her bedside every day for 3 months. When my father had his heart attack, Mr. Washington was the first person at the hospital. This family wouldn't be the same without him." David looked around at the neighbors, seeing their expressions change from anger to something deeper. They were looking at Harold with awe, with respect, with the recognition that they were in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. "But it's not just our family," Robert continued. "Show him the school photos, Patricia." Patricia scrolled through more images on her phone. Mr. Washington tutored struggling students for free for over 20 years. He organized holiday food drives, coached Little League baseball, helped build the new playground. Half the adults in this town were helped by him when they were children. The photos showed Harold in various community settings, helping children with homework, coaching young baseball players, working alongside other volunteers to build playground equipment. In every image, he was smiling, engaged, clearly beloved by the people around him. 3 years ago, Patricia said, the city named the new community center after him, the Harold Washington Community Center. Because in 40 years of public service, no one had done more to help children and families in need. David felt like he was drowning in the weight of his mistake. Every new piece of information made his actions seem worse, more inexcusable. He had treated a Medal of Honor recipient, a community pillar, a man who had devoted his life to serving others, like a common criminal. "And you know what the most remarkable thing is?" Robert asked, looking directly at David. "In all the years I've known him, through all the discrimination he's faced, all the times people have judged him by his appearance instead of his character, I have never once heard Harold speak bitterly about anyone. Not once." As if to prove Robert's point, Harold stepped forward slightly. "Officer Chen, I want you to know that I don't hold any anger toward you. You were trying to protect this neighborhood, and I respect that. Sometimes misunderstandings happen. This forgiveness coming from someone David had so wronged was almost unbearable." David wanted Harold to be angry, to yell at him, to demand justice. The grace Harold was showing only highlighted the contrast between his character and David's behavior. "However," Robert said, his judicial authority reasserting itself, "misunderstandings that stem from racial profiling are not just personal mistakes. They're symptoms of a larger problem in law enforcement." Patricia held up her phone again, showing a different screen. "Officer Chen, everything that happened here tonight has been recorded by at least a dozen people. It's already being posted on social media. The story of a police officer harassing a Medal of Honor recipient is exactly the kind of thing that goes viral. David's heart sank even further. His career, his reputation, his future, everything was potentially ruined. And not because he had tried to do something wrong, but because his biases and assumptions had led him to do something inexcusably stupid. "Dad," Patricia said, "show him the rest." Robert pulled out his own phone and opened a photo gallery. These are pictures from Memorial Day services, Veterans Day parades, military reunions. Mr. Washington has been honored at ceremonies with governors, senators, generals. He's met 3 presidents. And tonight, you made him stand with his hands on a police car like a criminal. The photos showed Harold in various formal settings, shaking hands with high-ranking officials, receiving awards and recognition, standing with other veterans at solemn ceremonies. In every image, he carried himself with quiet dignity, never seeking the spotlight but clearly respected by everyone around him. The local American Legion post is named after him, Robert continued. The VFW chapter has his portrait hanging in their meeting hall. The high school where he worked has a scholarship in his name. And every year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge, the Army sends representatives to honor him. David looked at Harold, trying to reconcile this information with the man he had stopped and searched. How could someone with such an incredible record of service and sacrifice end up being treated like a suspect? How could David have been so blind to the character of the person standing in front of him? But perhaps most importantly, Robert said, Harold has never, not once in over 70 years, used his status as a war hero to intimidate anyone or to get special treatment. He could have mentioned his Medal of Honor to you immediately and ended this entire encounter. But that's not who he is. He's humble, he's patient, and he has more class than most people could hope for. The weight of this revelation hit David like a physical force. Harold had suffered through this entire humiliating experience when he could have ended it with a single sentence. He had allowed himself to be questioned, searched, and detained, rather than pulling rank or demanding special treatment. It was a level of humility and grace that David had never encountered before. Patricia looked at David with a mixture of anger and pity. "Officer Chen, you need to understand something. Mr. Washington has faced discrimination and prejudice his entire life. He's been questioned by police before, been treated as suspicious for no reason other than his race. And every time he responds with the same dignity and grace he showed tonight. But that doesn't make it right. It doesn't excuse what happened here." The circle of neighbors had grown larger, and David could see people arriving who had heard about the incident on social media. Word was spreading quickly about what had happened, about who Harold really was, and about David's role in the confrontation. "This is going to be news," Robert said quietly. "Local Medal of Honor recipient harassed by police." It's exactly the kind of story that captures national attention, especially in today's climate. David felt the full weight of his situation crashing down on him. His career was likely over. His reputation was destroyed. His actions tonight would probably be studied in police training courses as an example of exactly what not to do. And he had brought it all on himself through his own prejudices and assumptions. The next 24 hours changed David's life forever. By morning, the videos from multiple phones had been posted across every social media platform. The hashtag #Medal of Honor harassed was trending nationwide. News outlets picked up the story within hours, and by noon, David found himself at the center of a national conversation about racial profiling and police accountability. The headlines were brutal and accurate. Police officer detains Medal of Honor. Recipient bringing flowers to memorial. War hero humiliated during routine memorial. Visit. The face of bias when prejudice blinds us to heroism. David sat in his apartment, watching his life unraveling on television. Every major network was covering the story. They showed Harold's military record, his community service, his decades of quiet heroism. Then they showed the cell phone footage of David making him place his hands on the patrol car, questioning his right to be in the neighborhood. The contrast was devastating. On one side, a genuine American hero who had devoted his life to serving others. On the other side, a young police officer whose biases had led him to humiliate someone who deserved nothing but respect. David's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting statements, fellow officers offering awkward support, friends and family trying to understand how this had happened. His police department had already placed him on administrative leave pending a full investigation. The police chief had issued a public apology to Harold and the community, promising a complete review of department policies and procedures, but it was the call from his captain that really drove home the severity of the situation. "Chen, what the hell were you thinking?" Captain Rodriguez's voice was a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We've got protesters outside the station, the mayor breathing down our necks, and every civil rights organization in the state demanding answers." David tried to explain, to describe his thought process, his training, his intentions, but every word sounded like an excuse. Every explanation revealed the depth of his assumptions and biases. "You detained a Medal of Honor recipient," Captain Rodriguez continued, "a man who risked his life for this country, who has spent 70 years serving his community, and you treated him like a criminal because he was black and walking in a white neighborhood. Do you understand how that looks?" David understood perfectly. It looked exactly as bad as it was. The department's internal investigation was swift and thorough. David's computer was searched, revealing a pattern of reports that showed a clear bias in his enforcement actions. His training records were reviewed, showing that he had completed all required courses on racial sensitivity and community policing, but had apparently learned nothing from them. 3 days after the incident, David was called to a meeting with department leadership, city officials, and representatives from several community organizations. Harold was there too, sitting quietly with the same dignity he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Officer Chen," the police chief began, "the investigation into your conduct has been completed. Your actions violated department policy, city guidelines, and basic principles of fair and equal treatment. You're being terminated from the police force effective immediately." David had expected this, but hearing it officially still felt like a physical blow. His career in law enforcement was over before it had really begun. The badge and uniform he had been so proud of were now symbols of his failure and prejudice. "However," the chief continued, "Mr. Washington has made a request that we take into consideration." David looked at Harold in surprise. What could Harold possibly want to say on his behalf? Harold stood up slowly, his dignity intact despite everything that had happened. "I've asked to speak because I believe in redemption and second chances. Officer Chen made a serious mistake, one that hurt me and exposed some troubling attitudes about race and prejudice. But I don't believe that mistake should define the rest of his life." The room was completely silent. David stared at Harold, unable to believe what he was hearing. "I've spent my life fighting for justice and equality," Harold continued, "but I've also learned that true change comes through education and understanding, not just punishment. Officer Chen is young. He can learn from this experience and become better." Harold turned to look directly at David. "I'm proposing that instead of simply being dismissed, Officer Chen spend 6 months working with community organizations, learning about the people he wronged, understanding the impact of his actions, and helping to bridge the divide between police and the communities they serve." The proposal was unprecedented. Harold was essentially asking for David to be given a chance at redemption, rather than simply being cast aside. It was an act of grace that David didn't deserve and couldn't understand. "Furthermore," Harold continued, "I'd like Officer Chen to work specifically with veterans organizations, learning about service and sacrifice, understanding what it means to put others before yourself." The city officials looked stunned. Here was the victim of police misconduct advocating for the officer who had wronged him, proposing a path toward redemption, rather than simply demanding punishment. David found his voice for the first time in the meeting. "Mr. Washington, I don't understand. Why would you do this for me? After what I did to you, why would you care what happens to me?" Harold smiled slightly, the same patient expression David remembered from that night on Elm Street. "Because I believe people can change, Officer Chen. I believe you can learn from this experience and become someone who serves his community with honor instead of prejudice. But more importantly, I believe that's what Tommy would have wanted." The mention of Harold's fallen friend brought tears to Patricia Mitchell's eyes. She had come to the meeting to support Harold and to ensure that justice was served. But now she was witnessing something extraordinary: forgiveness in action. "My friend Tommy died believing in the America we were fighting for," Harold continued. an America where people could overcome their prejudices, where second chances were possible, where redemption was always within reach. If I let anger and resentment win here, I'd be dishonoring his memory. The deal that was ultimately struck was unlike anything the city had seen before. David would indeed be terminated from the police force. That was non-negotiable. But he would also be required to complete 500 hours of community service, with organizations serving communities of color, veterans groups, and civil rights organizations. He would attend extensive training on racial bias, cultural sensitivity, and the history of discrimination in America. And perhaps most importantly, he would work directly with Harold for 3 hours every week, learning about service, sacrifice, and what it really meant to protect and serve. The first day of David's community service was at the Harold Washington Community Center, the facility named in honor of the man he had humiliated. He arrived early, nervous and uncertain about what to expect. The center was busy with after-school programs, senior citizens' activities, and various community meetings. Harold met him at the front desk, dressed in simple work clothes and carrying a toolbox. "We're going to start by helping maintain this building," Harold explained. "Part of serving your community is taking care of the spaces where people gather. As they work together, painting walls, fixing broken equipment, cleaning common areas." Harold began sharing stories, not just about his war service, but about the decades of quiet work he had done in the community. The children he had tutored, the families he had helped during difficult times, the small acts of kindness that had added up to a lifetime of service. "Service isn't about wearing a uniform or carrying a badge," Harold explained as they repaired a broken playground swing. "It's about putting other people's needs before your own, about making your community stronger and safer for everyone." David worked silently, absorbing not just Harold's words but his example. Here was a man who had every right to be bitter, who had faced discrimination and prejudice throughout his life, who had been wronged by David in the most public way possible. Yet he was spending his time trying to help David become a better person. Weeks turned into months, and gradually David began to understand what he had been missing in his approach to law enforcement. He worked with homeless veterans, learning about the challenges they faced and the services they needed. He volunteered at youth programs in predominantly minority neighborhoods, seeing firsthand the complex social issues that led to crime and the importance of community-based solutions. Most importantly, he spent every Tuesday evening with Harold, walking through the same neighborhood where their encounter had taken place, but now visiting the memorial garden where Harold honored his fallen friend. David learned about Tommy Mitchell, a young man who had been just 20 years old when he died, who had dreamed of becoming a teacher, who had saved Harold's life twice before losing his own. Every week for 23 years, Harold explained as he placed fresh flowers on the memorial stone, "I've come here to remember Tommy and to honor the promise I made to him. Not because I have to, but because it connects me to something larger than myself. It reminds me that we're all part of the same human family." The viral videos that had destroyed David's career eventually led to something positive. The incident sparked conversations about police training, community relations, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. Police departments across the country began using the footage as a training tool, showing officers how quickly assumptions and biases could lead to catastrophic mistakes. Harold was invited to speak at police academies, sharing his story and helping future officers understand the communities they would serve. He never spoke with anger or bitterness, but with the same patient wisdom he had shown that night on Elm Street. "Good policing isn't about assuming the worst in people," Harold would tell the young recruits. "It's about seeing the potential for good in everyone, about protecting and serving with equal dignity regardless of what someone looks like or where they come from." 6 months after that Tuesday evening encounter, David's community service was completed. He had been transformed by the experience, educated about the communities he had misjudged, and inspired by Harold's example of grace under pressure. But more than that, he had discovered a new path for his life. Instead of returning to law enforcement, David chose to continue the work he had begun. He took a job with a non-profit organization focused on improving police-community relations. He worked to implement training programs based on what he had learned, helping other officers understand the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. The last day of his required service, David returned to the Harold Washington Community Center one final time. Harold was there as he always was, working quietly to make his community better. "Mr. Washington," David said, "I need to thank you, not just for giving me a second chance, but for showing me what service really means. You could have destroyed my life completely, and you would have been justified in doing so. Instead, you chose to help me become better." Harold smiled, the same patient expression that had remained constant throughout their entire relationship. "David, the best way to thank me is to spend your life making sure what happened between us never happens to anyone else. Use your experience to help others learn and grow." "I will," David promised. "And I'll never forget the lesson you taught me, that true strength isn't in the power to hurt others, but in the grace to forgive them." As David walked away from the community center for the last time as a person completing court-ordered service, he reflected on how much his life had changed. A year ago, he had been a police officer with unconscious biases and unexamined prejudices. Today, he was someone committed to fighting those same biases wherever he found them. Harold continued his weekly visits to the Memorial Garden, just as he had for over 2 decades. But now those visits carried an additional meaning. They honored not just the memory of a friend lost in war, but the possibility of redemption and growth in peacetime. They represented the hope that even the most painful encounters could lead to positive change. Every Tuesday at 7:30, Harold would place fresh flowers on Tommy's memorial stone and reflect on the promise he had made so many years ago, to take care of Tommy's family, to serve his community, and to never give up on the possibility that people could change for the better. And every Tuesday at 7:30, somewhere across town, David would take a moment to remember the lesson Harold had taught him, that true heroism isn't found in a uniform or a badge, but in the courage to see past our prejudices and treat every person with the dignity they deserve.